wonderful, wonderful event to be invited to. Of course, put on by the California Federation of Republican Women.
Yes.
Thank you to President Sue Blair for having me here tonight. I know that it's been a couple of years of non-in-person events, so I'm very grateful to be here. And best of luck to Janet Price in her next Given the awful, terrible situation and position that the country has been in over the past year and a half, really, thanks to the Chinese Communist Party, and more specifically here at Gavin Newsom and his California lockdowns.
Yes.
It isn't lost on me that we are all here tonight together. And during the pandemic, I think many of us really took a look at our priorities, how we spend our time, and most importantly, who we spend our time with. So I'm deeply grateful and honored that you've chosen tonight to spend your time with me. Thank you. Now, I know that the Beach Boys wish that we could all be California girls. And while I grew up in Arizona, I spent many summers visiting this state, and I'm grateful and glad to be back. I find it kind of funny that I traded the People's Republic of Arlington, Virginia, where I live, for the People's Republic of California. We don't have palm trees there, though. My husband is also here with me tonight, and I thought it might be hard to convince him to get on a plane at 5:30 in the morning today, but when he heard he was going to be one of just a handful of men in a room full of conservative Republican women, he wasn't very hesitant to pack his bags and come with me. Far cry from the liberal, woke women in our neighborhood. So thank you again to the California Federation of Republican Women successfully organizing tonight, but more importantly, successfully in organizing to flip 4 congressional seats during the 2020 election. Thanks to your hard work, you've sent quality elected officials to Washington, D.C. after focusing on the issues that affect people who live here. Because of you, Nancy Pelosi's margin of power is one of the slimmest in history. And for weeks, Democrats have been in complete disarray about how to move Joe Biden's agenda forward. And it's been really fun to sit back and watch them go at it. So I think you all deserve a round of applause for this. Speaking of elections, I was in my hotel room earlier today watching a speech by Barack Obama. And man, that guy has not changed. At least for the better, anyway. He was strangely in Virginia campaigning for Terry McAuliffe. Terry McAuliffe. And his argument was that we can't elect a Republican to the governorship because we can't go backwards. But McAuliffe has already been governor, and he's a Clinton ally. But if bringing Obama into the state wasn't desperate enough for McAuliffe, McAuliffe's terrible dancing makes it clear that he's nervous about losing to Glenn Youngkin, who's an outsider from the private sector who has fresh ideas and experience. But during his speech, Obama essentially argued, and we've seen this become a theme, that Republicans are the greatest threat to democracy. Well, that doesn't make much sense, and actually it exposes the Democrats' agenda. They claim they want to save democracy by destroying and eliminating half of the voting population, which of course would destroy democracy. But you're all here tonight because you want to serve a purpose, to stand up for what you believe in, and to fight on principle for our republic. And let me tell you, America needs women in this room now more than ever. last 9 months have been quite the disaster for Joe Biden. We told you so.
We told you so.
He regularly skips town to go to Delaware and calls lids at 2 p.m. on Monday afternoon. And he's making things worse day by day. And the disagreement and debate that we're having goes far beyond political differences in basic governance or policy, if you can even call it debate. It's about right and wrong, good versus evil, and what it means to be free in America. And this isn't an exaggeration. This is something that Joe Biden talked about just this week. So during a town hall on CNN Thursday, which nobody really watched, I watched it so you didn't have to. One of their small number of viewers. President Joe Biden falsely accused unvaccinated Americans of wanting to infect fellow Americans with COVID. He made the outrageous smear and allegation while claiming freedom was the excuse used to do so. This is what he said. He said, the idea is that, look, the two things that concern me are, one, that those trying to make this a political issue, freedom. I have the freedom to kill you with my COVID. I mean, come on, freedom. That's what he said. And then he laughed about the idea that Americans should have a choice about what goes inside their bodies. This statement, of course, was just another one of Biden's many lies and typical presentations of misinformation to pit Americans against each other. So let's give him some science, since he claims that's what he wants to follow. According to the Centers for Disease Control, fully vaccinated Americans can also spread the virus. So, further, unvaccinated people aren't infected people, despite the left's intentions to portray them as somehow being dirty and in need of isolation from society to bolster their medical apartheid. And Biden solidified this position when he was asked about people being fired from their jobs for refusing to comply with overreaching government and private corporation vaccine mandates. So when CNN's Anderson Cooper asked him this question, he said, should police officers, emergency responders, and medical personnel who are mandated to get vaccines, if they don't, should they lose their jobs? And he replied, the president, to a room of hand-selected audience members who loudly and predictably applauded this foolish idea, yes and yes. So, I'd love to give booing. So this is a gleeful response from Biden about police officers, medical workers, and other first responders losing their jobs for refusing the COVID vaccine. And it proves that this push that they're on really isn't about public safety or health, especially given that most of these people have natural immunity. Instead, it's about power and purging those who dare to think independently, those who dare to ask questions, or people who just want to say, no thank you. So the people Americans praised as heroes at the height of the pandemic in 2020, working on the front lines about solid information about this disease and limited treatment, are now being tossed aside for daring to question or to resist demands from Biden's regime. And ironically, eliminating this ideological diversity that existed in our institutions will only sow more distrust in the institutions as they become ideological monopolies for the left. This is, Biden promised to be a uniter, and they're purposely doing the opposite. There's a purge that's happening, and we can all see it, and it has nothing to do with public health. And the way that Biden, the president of a once free country, speaks so flippantly of eliminating freedom should scare the citizenry far more than a virus the government has used to paralyze Americans with fear and to control their lives with endless government mandates. His answers, definition of freedom, and policy positions on vaccine mandates go far beyond the pandemic. They will have broad implications moving forward and consequences for the future of the country. Because then you have to ask the follow-up question, well, what's next? And what does history have to say about that road? And it is not kind. So if the President of the United States doesn't believe Americans have the freedom to make choices about their own health, what else does he think that he has control over? Nothing is off limits, of course, for totalitarians, and this is a title that Biden is embracing more and more each day from the Oval Office. Moderates, which Biden claimed to be a moderate in order to get elected, don't attack freedom this way, but tyrants do. And the left's general response to the pandemic has exposed them for their totalitarian tendencies and elitism. For them, it's not about deciding who gets to be free. For them, it is about deciding who gets to be free and who should stay in the permanent servant class. Like the socialist dictatorships that we see all over the world, whether it's in Cuba or Venezuela, the elite choose who gets to work and when they get to work and how much money they get to make. And we've seen that happening over the course of the past year and a half. So as Democrats continue their endless COVID coronavirus emergency in order to consolidate political power, they've also moved forward with flouting their own rules and standards. Gavin Newsom knows a lot about that. And in doing so, they're destroying the dignity and livelihoods of their very lower and middle class people that they claim to represent or care about. So we talked about, or we sung about New York and everyone was dancing. There were some people dancing at this event as well. So during the annual Met Gala event in New York City, I'm sure the women who are fashion interested in this room know all about it. It was in September, and a ticket to that event costs $30,000 and tables are $270,000. So guess who decides to show up at the Met Gala?
Our favorite designer.
Socialist Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she shows up in this white gown made by a woman who's evading her taxes, not paying her taxes, with the words "tax the rich" in red lettering on the backside. So when she was asked about the message that she was trying to send, she said, well, I'm just trying to talk about what it's like to be a working class woman of color at the Met.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Watching this as, you know, someone who likes to watch the fashion at the Met, I was thinking immediately, like others who share her political philosophy, Bernie Sanders, for example, she exposed herself as a total fraud, but certainly as a leftist interested in power. So after her interview of talking about how she's a working class woman who's a minority at the Met, she waltzed through the museum, laughing and posing along the way, and behind her were masked workers, many of them minorities, carrying her luxurious train as she smiled for the cameras. Their faces remained hidden, while she made herself even more famous among the rich she claims to despise. And first of all, AOC is not working class. She's not a working class woman, okay? Her short stint as a bartender was more of a tourist trip than a qualification for working class status. She grew up in the well-off suburb of Westchester, where the average household income is $178,000 a year. She went to Boston University, where tuition costs $56,000 a year. And now she's a member of Congress, where she makes $174,000 a year. And being in close proximity of Washington, D.C., I know that she lives in one of the swankiest apartment buildings in town, in a gentrified area, which I thought she was against. And ironically, above an Amazon-owned Whole Foods. She also drives a $50,000 Tesla, which she parks inappropriately all of the time. And for context on these numbers, the median household income in America sits at $67,000 a year. Now, there isn't a problem with AOC's upper class status. But there is a lot wrong with her lying about her so-called socioeconomic plight and personal history, especially as she continues to support oppressive COVID mandates that crush those less fortunate than her. But the behavior of the leftist elites since March of 2020 hasn't been confined to the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm sure you all heard about this. The locals here, during an outdoor fundraiser hosted by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Napa Valley a couple months ago, big dollar donors were given the luxury of sitting at their tables with their fellow upper-class peers, yucking it up, maskless and dignified. And those that they were served by, again, they were outside, not that it should make a difference, were forced to mask themselves, removing their identities and equalizing them all as the servant elk. Earlier this summer, when the Delta variant was allegedly surging, President Barack Obama moved forward with a massive birthday party in his $12 million estate in Martha's Vineyard. And when questions arose about it becoming a super spreader event, like they always accuse President Trump of doing, New York Times reporter Annie Carney reassured CNN viewers that those invited to the party were, quote, sophisticated and a vaccinated crowd. And therefore, there was nothing to worry about. So apparently the virus only goes after the sophisticated among the leftist elites in this country. And if you are part of that class and you get invited, it's not going to touch you.
It's very slow.
So those in the media responsible for covering such events and are always willing to cover for their fellow ideologues continually say, well, it's just a mask, what's the big deal? But subjugating fellow Americans to a life of hidden identity and human connection being removed behind a mask is a big deal. And limiting or erasing their identity as equal citizens by covering up their expressions is a big deal. And not only is it just a big deal, it's morally wrong. And subjecting children to masking, which has no solid scientific backing, for the sake of adults feeling comfortable, is absolutely grotesque.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the repeated hypocrisy from the powerful Democratic elites, of course, is not without consequence. After all, these are the same people controlling people's lives through federal decrees and politicized science. And it's not just simply an issue of hypocrisy. It's the consequences of these policies being implemented by hypocrites. Much like the communist and Marxist regimes and leaders they look up to, elitist Democrats are creating an underclass of masked and unidentifiable servants. And it's a perfect utopia of sameness that they don't subject themselves to. So throughout the pandemic, this is how it's always been. Workers earning a living at restaurants and small businesses were forced into unemployment. Their lives were destroyed, while the elites, politicians included, have never paid a price and were never beholden to the slogan, "We're all in it together." They used private jets to vacation while everyone else was locked down. And without shame, they shared their freedom and luxury through their Instagram accounts, including leaders of teachers' unions, by the way. And when Pelosi and California Governor Gavin Newsom were caught at hair salons and fancy dinner parties, they shrugged, knowing that there would be no consequences for them. But the bottom line is this. Everyone should be able to live as freely as the elites do, regardless of their jobs or their socioeconomic position. Through their heavy-handedness, Democrats have created an underclass in blue states and cities, which is antithetical to the promise of equality in America. But here's the good news. Americans are getting pretty tired of what they're seeing. And people who have the power to do something about it are stepping up. I'm sure you all saw the headlines earlier this month. Southwest was forced to cancel thousands of flights as workers and pilots forced to stick out over the company and Biden's vaccine mandate. And I wasn't flying that day, but if I were, I would be perfectly fine with my flight getting delayed. The disruption obviously caused widespread problems and prompted the company to back off threats to fire or put on unpaid leave employees who refused to comply. And Delta Airlines also took note and is now doing the same thing. We're also seeing this play out in schools. Fed up parents with all sorts of backgrounds, not the white supremacists the media and Democrats would like you to think, are taking back what is rightfully theirs, their children's education. Now, they haven't done this without risk, of course, because they're conservatives and Republicans, so therefore, you're allowed to target them. But because of that, what they're doing is even more courageous and admirable. So 2 weeks ago, the National School Boards Association wrote a letter to President Joe Biden, asking the Justice Department and the FBI to use the Patriot Act against parents.
Oh my gosh.
Conveniently, the parents they're targeting have been advocating at school board meetings for in-person learning, against masking children, and against teaching kids to hate or guilt each other based on their skin color. But this group classified those parents and asked the Justice Department to do the same, to classify them as domestic terrorists. So the White House quickly complied with this request and with the demands, and a couple days later, after they received this letter, the Department of Justice issued a warning that to these parents that the FBI would now be monitoring school board meetings across the country. This is a pattern among Democrats when they get into power. They use the federal government, specifically agencies under the jurisdiction of the Justice Department, as a weapon against political opponents. It's typical behavior. We saw this with the IRS targeting of Tea Party groups in 2010, when they dared to go up against President Obama's Obamacare agenda and reckless spending. We saw this in 2016, when the FBI illegally used illegal surveillance and FISA warrants to spy on Trump campaign officials. And now, far-left interest groups, in partnership with the White House, are using the Department of Justice to go after concerned parents. But as of yesterday, they're already losing. Yesterday, the NSBA walked back that letter calling for parents to be domestic terrorists and even issued an apology.
Wow. You're not going to be a domestic terrorist, right?
This is what they said. There was no justification for some of the language included in the letter. We should have had a better process in place to allow for consultation on a communication of the significance. The voices of parents should and must continue to be heard when it comes to decisions about their parents' education. So it wasn't just a sorry about the letter. They're acknowledging that parents have a significant role and that they're really the boss. So unfortunately for the teachers' unions and the school boards that they control, an apology actually won't be enough this time. This kind of outrageous behavior and targeting has launched the new school choice revolution. Which makes the current battle, even if it means DOJ classifying you as a domestic terrorist, worth winning in the long-term education war for the country. So bringing things back here to California, you're all watching a national disaster unfold as leftist policies crash the ports and create a supply chain crisis that could have been prevented. We've been told by Democrats to just get used to it, that shortages are fine, that high gas prices are something that every generation has to deal with, and that they're here to stay. Because after all, their philosophy is about managing decline. But we don't simply manage decline. This is the United States of America. And while Democrats are happy to surrender, I don't think people in this room are willing to do that. Everybody has a role to play. Everybody has individual strength, whether you're an organizer, a door knocker, a communicator, an office holder, someone who's capable of competent leadership. There's a role for everybody to do their part, big or small. And in a time when the left claims truth is subjective, we have to stand up for the facts. In a world where logic seems to be suspended when making impactful decisions, we must reiterate its importance. And in a place where the heroes of last year, nurses, doctors, police, and firefighters, are being fired for a personal medical decision, we must stand up for them and remind them in a country of their selfless service and sacrifice.
Yes.
The left we're facing today is vicious and brutal and acts without mercy to get what they want. We've seen that. They plan to take everything away from us and to destroy the things that bring us joy. There is no tolerance from them, and certainly no grace, only vicious tactics and lies. This reality, of course, can feel very overwhelming, but the good news is that we're not facing this onslaught alone. There are more of us than we think. I have to say, I am shocked that this is the largest Republican women's group in the country, being in Deep Blue, California.
Yeah.
Because you know that you have to fight for what you want. And you're not going to get complacent in a place where everybody happens to agree with each other.
Yep.
So I said, there are more of us than you think. I was joking about the People's Republic of Arlington. But, just the other day, we found another quiet conservative neighbor who is holding an event for Glenn Youngkin next weekend at her house. And we got invited to go. It'll be great. We learned her husband worked for President Donald Trump. And in between Biden and hate has no home here signs, there's another conservative couple doing their part to stand up for what we believe in just down the street. We always make fun of those signs. It's like, I always feel like making my own sign that says, hate actually lives here. Right in this house, it's here. What does that mean, hate has no home here on the lawn side? It's pretty stupid and meaningless. Anyway. And let me tell you, do you know how many Let's Go Brandon t-shirts and masks we sold today? Of a woman who was just absolutely disgusted with this weird, overly sexualized OkCupid advertisement in the subway that portrayed freedom, some kind of weird sexual freedom in return for vaccination. So if you got vaccinated, you can go do all these weird things that were being portrayed on these posters, and I will not describe them because I appreciate that you don't want to be subjected to that kind of vision. But she saw these advertisements, she's standing in the subway, there's a woman filming her, and she keeps talking about how it's gross, how kids are gonna see what's happening. Why are these things here? It's propaganda to try and sell this weird sexual situation to everybody in exchange for freedom. Very weird. So she's complaining, and this male bystander in the video, who's young, and he says, oh, you're just overreacting. It's not that big of a deal. And she keeps going. And she starts tearing down these signs in the subway. And all of a sudden, the guy who said she's overreacting starts helping her. And he's like, oh, there's one over there. There's another one over here. Let's go to the next train car and tear them down in there. And the woman who's filming her is applauding her and saying, yes, let's tear down this disgusting, gross propaganda that we're being subjected to and our children are being subjected to on the subway. And so, you know, in Comrade Bill de Blasio's New York City, which is a place that you can't eat in a restaurant now without showing your papers, or to even get a cup of coffee, this woman had the courage to stand up in the subway in front of a bunch of strangers and say that she had had enough. And most importantly, her actions inspired others to do the same when they realized they weren't alone. So being in California reminds me of my friend Andrew Breitbart, who of course was a force of nature who got results, right?
Yeah.
The first time I met him was at the Rancho Mirage Center during Young America's Foundation conference. And one of Andrew's most important lessons as an activist and a journalist was for us to remain happy warriors. Now don't be mistaken, Andrew was absolutely ruthless, with the truth to back him up. And how could we forget that he was the guy who took down Anthony Weiner and commandeered a press conference in New York City where he called out the media for falsely accusing him of hacking Anthony Weiner's Twitter account when he tweeted some things that he shouldn't have. It was hilarious, and he did it with a smile. He used to rollerblade through groups of protesting leftists while he mocked them to their faces on his rollerblades, going through LA, Occupy Wall Street. And that was great, because the left wants nothing more than to steal our joy. They want us to be just as miserable as they are. We must never allow them to do that. Besides, there really is something especially satisfying about winning with a smile on your face. And there's inspiration everywhere. The women in this room are working to put Republicans in elected office. The parents in Loudoun County and elsewhere are fighting and winning against critical race theory. Pilots, air traffic controllers, police officers, and others are engaging in a peaceful but civil disobedience to say no to medical apartheid. And as a daughter of the American Revolution, rebellion runs pretty deep for me. You could say it's genetic. So if my ancestors could stand up and say, enough is enough, I think I can too. So there are certainly challenges ahead. There always have been. There always will be. But I know the women in this room have never been afraid of taking on challenges, especially in times when courage is needed most. So with that, I'll take your questions, and thank you for listening.